On Valentine's Day, 1988, a young woman was found murdered in a Cardiff flat. Within months, 5 innocent men were behind bars, framed by the very system meant to deliver justice. This is the story of Lynette White and the scandal that would expose one of Britain's darkest miscarriages of justice. It begins in a place both forgotten and legendary, a square mile of land pressed between the sea and the city, where ships once carried coal across the world, and where generations of sailors, immigrants, and outcasts forged a community unlike any other in Britain. Cardiff called it Butetown, but to most it was known by a name whispered with a mixture of fear, pride, and myth: Tiger Bay. For more than a century, this place was a crucible of change. Coal money had turned it into one of the busiest ports in the world, a gateway where men from over 50 nations docked, worked, and stayed. Somali seamen, Yemeni traders, West Indian sailors, Irish laborers, they all made their homes in the same patch of streets, giving birth to Britain's first truly multicultural community. Outsiders condemned it, insiders cherished it. For those who grew up there, it was more than a dockland ghetto. It was family, it was survival, it was identity. But by the 1980s, Tiger Bay's glory had long since faded. The coal trade was dead, jobs were scarce, and the city fathers had begun a ruthless campaign to erase its history. Streets were bulldozed, families uprooted, and glass towers promised to rise where terraces and chapels once stood. Officially, it was now Cardiff Bay. But to those who lived under the railway bridge that separated it from the rest of the city, it was still the Bay. And it still carried the weight of suspicion. This was a place police watched closely. Stop and search was routine. Young black men in particular were treated with mistrust. The city beyond the bridge rarely welcomed them. Clubs and pubs in the center turned them away. If they wanted nightlife, it was their own clubs: the Casablanca, a reggae and blues venue in a converted chapel, or the rougher North Star, where sex workers gathered after nights on the streets. For many, this division wasn't just about entertainment. It was about belonging, about where you were permitted to exist. It was in this world, on a bitterly cold Valentine's night in 1988, that a young woman named Lynette White made her way into a dingy flat above a betting shop on James Street. Lynette was just 20 years old, known in the docks as a sex worker but remembered by those close to her as bright, funny, and restless. She had dreams, moving to London with her boyfriend, Stephen Miller, building something better than the fractured life she knew in Cardiff. But that night, her path crossed with violence so extreme it would scar the city forever. Neighbors later recalled hearing screams cutting through the stillness of the early hours, piercing, desperate cries that rose and fell, and then stopped. Some dismissed it as a drunken argument. Others were unsettled but stayed inside. In Tiger Bay, you learned not to interfere. By morning, the fog from the estuary hung low, and the streets gave little sign of what had happened inside that flat. It was only later, when a friend raised the alarm, that police forced their way through the door. What they found inside shocked even the most hardened detectives. Blood pooled on the floor and sprayed across the walls. Lynette's body lay twisted and broken, her throat cut, stabbed dozens of times in a frenzy that spoke of unrestrained rage. It was a killing so brutal that seasoned investigators compared it to the savagery of Jack the Ripper. Within hours, the story was everywhere. The press called it a Valentine's Day horror. Police held urgent briefings. Officers scoured drains for a discarded knife. Divers searched the docks, and door-to-door inquiries began. The case seemed straightforward at first. Track Lynette's final movements, speak to her clients, question her boyfriend. But what began that day would spiral into one of the darkest chapters in British legal history. A case that destroyed lives, exposed deep flaws in policing, and would ultimately be remembered as the UK's greatest miscarriage of justice. In the days that followed, suspicion fell not on an unknown killer, but on a group of young men from the Bay. Men who had not even known Lynette White, but whose faces and names fit a narrative that investigators seemed determined to build. Among them were Ronnie Actie, his cousin Ronnie, Tony Paris, Yusef Abdullahi, and Stephen Miller himself, the man who loved Lynette, soon to be branded her murderer. What happened to these 5 men, and to a city that turned against its own? is a story not only of a killing, but of prejudice, betrayal, and the fight for justice that would take decades to win. And it all begins here, with the murder of a young woman in a cold, damp flat on James Street. A crime that should have led to truth, but instead opened the door to one of the most infamous scandals the British justice system has ever seen. The murder of Lynette White did not simply shake Cardiff. It cut to the heart of how the city saw itself. To understand why, we need to step back into the streets and shadows of Tiger Bay, into the world Lynette moved through, and the forces that had long been building beneath the surface. By the late 1980s, Cardiff was a city in transition. The industries that once gave it pride and purpose, coal, steel, shipping, were gone. Unemployment gripped entire communities, and nowhere felt the decline more sharply than Butetown. Decades of neglect had left its high-rise flats crumbling, its streets scarred with poverty. Yet amid the hardship, there was resilience. Families held on to what dignity they could. Elders remembered Tiger Bay's golden days, telling stories of jazz clubs, sailors, and a community that thrived despite prejudice. But that pride was under siege. Cardiff's leaders were determined to erase the reputation of Tiger Bay, replacing it with the glossy promise of Cardiff Bay. They spoke of regeneration, of glass-fronted office blocks, shopping centers, and luxury apartments that would transform the waterfront. To investors, the city pitched a bright, modern future. But for the people who had lived under the railway bridge for generations, regeneration looked a lot like expulsion. That tension, between the image Cardiff wanted to project and the reality it wanted to bury, became the backdrop to Lynette White's murder. A killing in the docks was not just a tragedy. To the city fathers, it was a threat to the rebrand. And to the police, it was a test of control. They needed a culprit, and they needed one quickly. Lynette herself was more than the one-dimensional label she was given in the papers. Vice girl. She was a daughter, a girlfriend, a young woman barely out of her teens. Friends recalled her laughter, her love of music, her knack for making people feel at ease. But she was also vulnerable, caught in the cycle of sex work, a world where women often went missing, where violence was a constant risk, and where society's disdain left them with few places to turn for help. On Valentine's night, she wore her boyfriend's brown leather jacket, the heavy coat draped around her small frame. To Stephen Miller, it was a symbol of intimacy. To Lynette, it was comfort. But in the flat on James Street, it became something else. A witness, stained with her blood, wrapped around her body as she struggled in her final moments. The brutality of her murder stunned investigators. 50 stab wounds. Some counted 70. A throat cut so deeply it was almost decapitation. To many, it looked like a crime of passion, an eruption of rage, uncontrolled and personal. But others saw something different. A frenzy born not of love, but of hate. Whoever had killed Lynette had done so with extraordinary violence, and with extraordinary speed. Neighbors described hearing screams that night. Long, piercing cries for help. Some lasted minutes, and yet no one called the police. In Butetown, you didn't. The area had long been painted as dangerous, its people as criminals, and residents had learned that involving the authorities often brought more trouble. By the time Lynette's body was found, the flat was silent. Police officers who arrived at the scene described the air as heavy, metallic with the smell of blood. Her body lay beneath a window, the dim yellow glow of a street lamp cutting across her face. Around her were the signs of a desperate struggle. A broken wristwatch, matchsticks scattered across a bathtub, torn clothing twisted tight. Everything about the room spoke of chaos, of violence that had erupted suddenly and consumed everything. Pathologist Bernard Knight was called in to examine the scene. He had seen death in many forms, but even he was struck by the savagery here. His preliminary conclusion was simple, stark. Lynette White had died of multiple stab wounds and a cut throat. Time of death was estimated around the early hours of February 14th. News traveled fast. By the next morning, Valentine's Day murder dominated headlines. The South Wales Echo printed her photograph, a striking young woman with soft eyes and 1980s curls. To many, it was the first time they had seen her face. And with that image came judgment. In Cardiff, whispers spread quickly. She was a prostitute, wasn't she? For some, that single word explained everything. But for others, it raised an urgent, unspoken question. If the police could not protect a young woman like Lynette, who could they protect? Her boyfriend, Stephen Miller, known to friends as Pineapple, for the spiky dreadlocks tied high on his head, was among the first questioned. He wept openly at the station, pleading that he had nothing to do with her death. His grief was raw, uncontrolled, his emotions spilling in front of detectives. But soon, his tears would be used against him, recast as signs of guilt. And beyond Stephen, the net began to widen. Officers looked toward the bay itself, toward its young black men who had long been marked as troublemakers, fighters, outsiders. Men like Ronnie Actie, towering, broad, with a reputation for his fists. Men like Tony Paris, Yusef Abdullahi, and Ronnie Actie. Some of them had never met Lynette, never even spoken her name. Yet within months, they would be at the center of the investigation, paraded as monsters in one of the most infamous trials Wales had ever seen. The story of Lynette White's murder is not just about a single crime. It is about the choices that followed. Choices by police officers under pressure, by prosecutors eager for convictions, by a system that seemed determined to find culprits rather than truth. It is about how prejudice and desperation combined to create a nightmare that ruined lives and would take decades to unravel. For the people of Tiger Bay, it was confirmation of what they had long feared, that when a crime demanded answers, the city would not look for justice. It would look for scapegoats. And in the winter of 1988, with Lynette White's blood still fresh on the walls of James Street, the search for scapegoats had already begun. The police knew the first 24 hours were critical. They called it the golden hour, the short window in which evidence is fresh, witnesses' memories sharp, and leads still warm. But in the case of Lynette White, that golden hour was already slipping away. The screams had gone unreported. The crime scene had been contaminated by multiple officers walking through before it was sealed, and whatever traces the killer left behind were dissolving into the damp Cardiff air. Still, there was urgency. Detective Chief Superintendent John Williams, a veteran officer nearing the end of his career, was placed in charge. He stood before the press that morning, his words measured, his accent thick with the valleys. This was a brutal, frenzied, sadistic attack, he told reporters. The language was deliberate, chosen not only to shock the public but to provoke a response. Someone, somewhere, must know something. The appeal was simple: trace Lynette's last movements. She had last been seen alive on the Tuesday before her death, nearly 5 days earlier. What had she been doing? Who had she been with? Why had she disappeared from her usual haunts in Butetown? The police needed answers. But in asking those questions, they also revealed something else, something that would shape the entire case. For the first time, in front of cameras and microphones, it was confirmed. Lynette White was a prostitute. That one word carried enormous weight. In 1980s Cardiff, sex work was a world shrouded in shame, judged harshly not only by the public but by the authorities themselves. Painted Lynette as risky, reckless, tainted. And crucially, it provided police with an easy narrative. If she had been killed, surely the answer lay in that world. Her clients, her associates, her boyfriend. It also meant that witnesses were far less likely to come forward. Men who had seen Lynette in her final days would remain silent, unwilling to risk their reputations by admitting they had paid for her services. Women who worked alongside her feared police harassment if they spoke too openly. Silence descended, and in that silence, speculation thrived. The crime scene itself told a grim story. Professor Knight's examination catalogued wound after wound, numbering them carefully, knowing that each slice of the knife spoke of time, of intent, of savagery. 50 major wounds, possibly 70. Defensive cuts on her hands suggested she had fought back fiercely, trying to fend off the blade until her strength gave way. Whoever attacked her had been relentless, stabbing long after death was certain. To the detectives, this was both a clue and a complication. Frenzied killings often pointed to someone known to the victim, a lover, a partner, someone emotionally entangled. But they also could be the work of a stranger, a client whose rage had exploded. In truth, the evidence could be read either way. And soon, under the pressure of media attention and public fear, the evidence would be bent to fit whichever theory was most convenient. Meanwhile, the Bay was alive with rumor. In the pubs and clubs, people whispered about the killing. Some swore they had heard the screams. Others claimed to know who was involved, pointing fingers at petty criminals, drifters, even sailors passing through. The gossip swirled like smoke, thick but insubstantial, impossible to hold. For John Actie, waking up in his home on Butte Street, the news came from a neighbor. "Did you hear about the murder?" At first, the name meant nothing to him. Lynette White, he didn't know her. He had never spoken to her, never crossed paths with her in the tight-knit circles of Butetown nightlife. To him, it was another tragedy in a city that had seen its share. Only later, when he saw her photograph in the paper, did the connection strike him. She was the girlfriend of Stephen Miller, the man they called Pineapple. Stephen was known around the Bay, though not deeply. He wasn't one of the old families, not part of the Tiger Bay lineage that stretched back generations. He had come from London, bringing with him a mixture of shyness and bravado, and had settled into a life with Lynette. To those who knew him, he seemed nervous, eager to please, often anxious. Hardly the portrait of a killer. Yet within hours of Lynette's death, he was at the center of the investigation, questioned for hours on end, stripped of his clothing for forensic testing, escorted everywhere by police. At that point, detectives insisted he was not a suspect. But in reality, suspicion had already begun to form. In the eyes of investigators, the boyfriend was always the first place to look. And Stephen's emotional breakdowns, his tears, his rambling explanations, would soon be twisted into something more sinister. Across the Bay, other men went about their lives, unaware that fate was moving toward them. John Actie, about to become a father. Tony Paris, known for his sense of humor. Yusef Abdullahi, trying to make ends meet. None of them could have guessed that within a year, their names would be infamous, tied forever to a crime. But in February 1988, all of that was still to come. For now, Cardiff was gripped by the horror of Lynette's death. The newspapers ran her face on the front page, the city buzzing with fear and curiosity. A young woman had been butchered on Valentine's Day. Killer was loose, and the police, desperate for answers, were preparing to cast a net so wide it would ensnare the innocent along with the guilty. What no one knew then was that this case would not be solved in days or months, or even years. It would drag on for decades, through trials and appeals, through false confessions and retracted statements, through ruined lives and shattered families. And it would expose, piece by piece, a truth more disturbing than the crime itself, that sometimes the greatest injustice comes not from the killer, but from those sworn to find him. In the days after Lynette White's death, Butetown felt watched. Police cars patrolled the narrow streets, officers knocking on doors, asking questions, searching drains, shining torches into alleys. The Casablanca's music still throbbed at night, the pubs still poured their lager, but the air was different now, heavier, charged with suspicion. People in the Bay had always lived with police scrutiny. Stop and search, raids, the constant reminder that under the bridge you were in a different city, one that didn't trust you. But this felt different. This time it was not about petty crime, or a bar fight, or the smell of cannabis smoke drifting from a club. This time it was about murder. And not just any murder. This was a killing so savage it seemed almost inhuman. 50 stab wounds, maybe 70. A throat cut so deep the wound itself seemed to scream. A young woman, a daughter, a girlfriend, a friend, cut down on Valentine's Day, the very night that symbolized love. The city beyond the bridge demanded answers. Newspapers carried her photograph, her beauty framed against headlines that branded her vice girl. Politicians called for calm but hinted at the danger lurking in the docks. Investors whispered about the new Cardiff Bay development and wondered if the old shadows would swallow the new dreams. Inside the police station, the hunt had already begun to narrow. Stephen Miller sat in a small room, tears streaking his face, repeating over and over that he hadn't done it. His grief poured out, but the detectives watching him did not see innocence. They saw weakness, They saw someone they believed could be broken. And beyond Stephen, other names were beginning to circulate. Men who lived in the Bay, men who were familiar to the police, men whose faces fit a certain expectation. They hadn't been near James Street that night. Some didn't even know Lynette White. But soon that would not matter, because what was about to unfold was not just a murder investigation. It was the start of something far more corrosive. A miscarriage of justice so profound it would take more than 20 years to unravel. A case that would put innocent men behind bars, destroy families, and leave the real killer free. The tragedy of Lynette White was not only that her life was stolen, but that her death became the pretext for an injustice that scarred a community and shook the foundations of British law. And it all began here, in February 1988, with a young woman's screams echoing into the night, and a city that looked for justice but was already preparing to take the wrong path. The morning after Lynette White's body was discovered, Cardiff woke to a city on edge. Headlines blared from the front pages, her photograph staring out in stark black and white. The words were designed to shock. Frenzied killing. Valentine's Day murder. Beneath them, the grainy image of a 20-year-old woman with soft eyes and a defiant smile, frozen in time. By midday, the docks buzzed with rumor. In the Custom House pub, women who had worked alongside Lynette traded stories in hushed tones. Some admitted they hadn't seen her for days. Others said she'd been worried, distracted, cutting contact even with those closest to her. None could explain why, but all of them knew this much. If one of their own could be killed with such savagery, it could happen to any of them. At Cardiff Central Police Station, Detective Chief Superintendent John Williams and his team faced a different kind of pressure. The cameras had been rolling since dawn, the press baying for answers. Politicians wanted reassurance. And behind it all loomed the shadow of Cardiff's regeneration project. The city's leaders wanted the Bay scrubbed clean of its reputation for vice and violence. Another unsolved murder in Tiger Bay was the last thing they could afford. Williams knew the clock was ticking. Every hour without a suspect meant public confidence ebbed away. And so the hunt turned quickly, almost inevitably, to those closest to Lynette. Stephen Miller was brought back into the interview room. He had already been questioned the night before, but this time the tone was different. Detectives leaned in, their voices sharper, less sympathetic. They asked where he had been that weekend, who he had seen, why Lynette had avoided him in the days before her death. Stephen was overwhelmed. His emotions spilled over in torrents of words. Long, rambling explanations about his love for Lynette, his plans to take her to London, their arguments, their reconciliations. His mind circled back to the same points again and again, a spiral of grief and panic. To the detectives, his tears seemed suspicious. To them, grief didn't look like this. Guilt did. What Stephen didn't know was that his vulnerability made him exactly the kind of suspect police believed they could break. He had a stammer, he struggled under pressure, and he craved reassurance. These traits would soon become weapons turned against him. Meanwhile, detectives fanned out across Butetown, knocking on doors, gathering statements. The streets around James Street, still damp from February rain, filled with uniformed officers combing for clues. Drains were pumped, bins emptied, hedges searched. Sub-aqua divers trawled the docks for a knife. Nothing emerged. Inside the station, however, another picture was being drawn. Officers began compiling lists of men they described as usual suspects. Those known to police, those with reputations for fighting, those who, in the eyes of authority, belonged to the Bay's underclass. Their names were written on whiteboards in the incident room. And slowly, inevitably, the net began to tighten around men who had nothing to do with Lynette White at all. Back in Butetown, life carried on with unease. At the Casablanca, the reggae still played, but conversations kept circling back to the murder. At the North Star, the working girls drank cans of lager and tried to drown out their fear. Some remembered seeing Lynette days before, still working the streets despite her plans to leave for London. Others said she'd seemed distant, troubled, but no one could imagine the horror of her final hours. For Stephen Miller, the horror had only just begun. Night after night, he sat in the interrogation room, exhausted, confused, still reeling from the shock of losing the woman he loved. He asked if he could go home, just for a few hours, to feed her dog. The detectives refused. Instead, they pressed harder. Why had Lynette avoided him? Why had she been killed in a flat he denied ever visiting? Why, if he loved her, did she lie dead while he lived? The questions circled endlessly, like vultures, and with each round, Stephen's defenses crumbled. He didn't know it yet, but he was being steered, word by word, toward a confession. And in the streets outside, names were whispered: John Actie, Tony Paris, Ronnie Actie, Yusef Abdullahi. Men whose lives were about to be consumed by an investigation that was less. The room was bare. A table, a chair, a tape recorder. The fluorescent light hummed faintly, washing everything in a pale glow. Stephen Miller sat hunched forward, his hands clasped, his eyes swollen from crying. Across from him, two detectives adjusted their notes. The tape clicked on. It was a ritual Stephen would come to know intimately. The sound of the machine, the official cautions, the questions that felt less like requests and more like accusations. At first, the detectives kept their tone even measured. They asked about Lynette's movements, about the Tuesday when she disappeared. Stephen's answers were long, unstructured, the way grief often is. He circled back to their arguments, to how she had accused him of seeing another woman, to how he had denied it. He described their reconciliation, the meals they shared, the bath she had taken, the way they had played cards. He repeated himself, trying to find the thread that would make the tragedy make sense. But detectives weren't looking for sense. They were looking for cracks. "Why didn't she meet you on Tuesday night?" one asked. "I don't know," Stephen stammered. She didn't come. But she always did before?" "Yes, always." "So why not this time?" "I don't know." His voice cracked, frustration bleeding into fear. This was the rhythm of the interrogation. Question, denial, suspicion. Each answer turned back on itself. Each protest made to sound like an admission. Stephen's stammer, something he had lived with since childhood, made things worse. To the detectives, his pauses and hesitations were signs of deception. To Stephen, they were simply the way his words came. But in this room, under this pressure, every stumble became another nail in the coffin being built around him. Hours turned into days. He was not under arrest, technically, but he was not free to leave. When he asked to go home, he was told to wait. When he grew too tired to think, he was offered a mattress in the cells. He refused, unwilling to sleep behind a locked door, but the exhaustion etched itself deeper into his face. The more he faltered, the more confident the detectives became. They began to feed him details, planting seeds in his mind. What if Lynette had been with someone else? What if he had followed her? What if he had lost control? It was a dangerous game. Suggestion blurred into memory. Memory blurred into confession. And slowly, piece by piece, Stephen Miller's words were reshaped into something they had never been. Outside the interrogation room, the investigation sprawled wider. House-to-house inquiries produced little of value. Witnesses were vague, uncertain. Some remembered screams. Some thought they saw Lynette in the days before her death. But nothing concrete emerged. Frustration grew. The case needed progress, and progress meant suspects. And so the list of names expanded. In Butetown, the men whose reputations preceded them began to feel the shift. John Actie, broad-shouldered, quick-tempered, proud of his Tiger Bay heritage, noticed the sidelong glances, the whispers that traveled faster than truth. His cousin, Ronnie, quieter, less conspicuous, felt it too. Tony Paris, charismatic, with an easy laugh that hid his struggles, was mentioned in conversations he never heard. And Yusef Abdullahi, hard-working, known in the community but little understood by police, found himself caught in the growing tide of suspicion. They did not yet know their names had been written on lists in an incident room, circled, discussed. They did not know their lives were about to be turned upside down. For now, the focus remained on Stephen. He was the weak link, the man detectives believed they could bend. And bend him they did. In one session, exhausted, confused, desperate to please, Stephen began to echo back fragments of the narrative suggested to him. Yes, maybe he had argued with Lynette. Yes, maybe he had followed her. Yes, maybe things had gotten out of hand. To detectives, this was progress, the breakthrough they needed. To Stephen, it was survival, the hope that if he said what they wanted, the questions would stop, the nightmare would end. But of course, it did not end. It was only the beginning. The words he spoke in that room under pressure would echo for years. They would be used to build a case not just against him, but against 4 other men who had nothing to do with Lynette White's murder. They would stand in court as confessions, even though they were nothing more than the fractured words of a frightened young man cornered by authority. And once those words were on tape, the machinery of justice turned against him with unstoppable force. What should have been a search for a killer was becoming something else. A performance, a story constructed piece by piece, designed to fit the narrative that the police, the press, and the public wanted. In that story, Stephen Miller was not a grieving boyfriend. He was a suspect, and soon others would join him. The strategy was not new. When an investigation faltered, when evidence failed to point clearly to a killer, pressure shifted from discovery to construction. If the facts didn't produce an answer, the answer would be manufactured. In 1988 Cardiff, that meant turning the spotlight onto Tiger Bay's young men. They were visible, they were familiar to police, and they carried reputations, sometimes earned, often exaggerated, that made them easy to cast as villains. Ronnie Actie was one of those men. To outsiders, his size and his temper preceded him. He was tall, broad, with the kind of presence that filled a room before he spoke. Stories about his fights circulated like folklore. But to those who knew him, John was far more than the caricature. He loved his dogs, adored children, and had just become a father himself. His baby daughter, Remy, had been born days after Lynette White was killed. For John, life should have been opening onto joy. Instead, suspicion was already beginning to cloud his horizon. Tony Paris was another. A natural joker, he put on a smiling front. A man who tried to laugh even when life gave him little reason to. He carried burdens most didn't see: poverty, discrimination, the constant weight of being judged not by who he was but by where he came from. Still, he found solace in music, in friends, in the rhythm of the Bay's nightlife. But behind his laughter lay vulnerability. Ronnie Actie, quieter than his cousin John, was less of a fighter and more of a shadow, present, respected, but not notorious. Yet, in the eyes of police, family ties were enough to mark him. And then there was Yusef Abdullahi. Older than some of the others, he was known for his easygoing nature and his willingness to work hard at whatever jobs came his way. He was not a man of violence, not a man who thrived on conflict. But he, too, was of the Bay. And that, in the eyes of many in authority, was guilt enough. None of these men had been near James Street on the night Lynette was killed. None had reason to harm her. Most didn't even know her name. But as weeks passed and no clear suspect emerged, their names rose higher on the list. It was a process almost invisible to them at first. Police cars idling outside their homes. Officers asking casual questions that weren't really casual at all. Rumors spreading through pubs that the Acties were being looked at, that Tony Paris had been seen in the wrong place, that Yusef had connections no one could quite define. Gossip filled the gaps where evidence was absent. And over it all hung the unspoken truth. The city needed answers. The regeneration project, the image of Cardiff as a modern, forward-looking capital, could not survive a murder unsolved in its docklands. Pressure filtered down from politicians to police, from senior detectives to constables. The case had to be closed. The killer had to be found. Inside the interrogation rooms, Stephen Miller remained the fulcrum. Stephen's mind swirled. Tired, grieving, desperate, he began to repeat what they suggested. Yes, he might have followed Lynette. Yes, he might have argued. Yes, maybe he had lost control. Each word a lifeline to him, a chance to end the relentless barrage. But each word was also a chain, binding him to a story he had never lived. The tapes would later play in court. They would be presented as confessions, as damning proof that Stephen Miller had killed his girlfriend. But anyone who listened closely could hear something else. The confusion, the fatigue, the desperation of a man trying to give the police what they wanted just to make it stop. That desperation was contagious. Soon, Stephen's words would be used not only against him but against others. Detectives began to suggest names. Had he seen John Actie? Did Tony Paris know something? Was Yusef involved? Slowly, under the pressure of repeated questioning, Stephen began to nod along. His words, twisted and coerced, implicated men who had never even stepped foot inside 7 James Street. This was how the case against the Cardiff Five was built. Not on evidence, not on forensic science, not on eyewitness accounts that stood up to scrutiny, but on the fragile words of a grieving young man broken down until he would say almost anything. And outside the walls of the police station, the bay braced itself. Mothers warned their sons to be careful, to keep their heads down. Fathers muttered about injustice, about how the police were always looking for someone to blame. Elders shook their heads, remembering the riots of the early 80s, when the bay had burned with anger at the same kind of treatment. The murder of Lynette White had shaken the city. But the investigation that followed was about to shake it even more, because very soon the first arrests would be made. And once the machinery of prosecution began to turn, it would not stop, no matter who was crushed beneath its wheels. The knock always came the same way. Sharp, heavy, and impossible to ignore. For the men of Butetown, it was the sound they dreaded. Police at the door. For John Actie, it happened early, before the streets had properly stirred. His baby daughter was barely a week old, her cries still unfamiliar in the small house. He was trying to settle into fatherhood, learning the rhythm of nappies and night feeds, when fists rattled the door and voices barked his name. John Actie. Police, open up. He knew in his gut before he even stood. When he pulled the door open, uniforms filled the doorway, plainclothes officers behind them. They pushed inside, their presence crowding the small space. A warrant was waved, his rights recited, though the words barely registered. He asked what this was about, but the answers were vague. Questioning suspicion, helping with inquiries. The cuffs clicked around his wrists all the same. John's partner, still recovering from childbirth, stood in shock, clutching their newborn. The baby's wail rose above the commotion, a piercing reminder that this was not just about John. It was about the family torn apart in an instant. Across town, Tony Paris was taken in much the same way. He tried to mask his fear with a grin, joking weakly with the officers, but the bravado faded as soon as he was shoved into the back of the van. Ronnie Actie was picked up too, quieter, bewildered, insisting he had nothing to do with any of this. And then there was Yusef Abdullahi, confused, angry, demanding to know why his name had even been mentioned. The answer, though never spoken outright, was simple. They were the bay's men. They were visible, they were known, and they fit the story detectives were piecing together. By the time the sun rose higher over Cardiff, 5 names were locked inside police stations. Stephen Miller, John Actie, Ronnie Actie, Tony Paris, and Yusef Abdullahi. The press didn't wait for trials or verdicts. Headlines screamed about arrests in the Valentine's Day murder. Photographs of the men, some smiling, some scowling, some dazed, were plastered across newspapers. Overnight, they were transformed from sons, fathers, friends, and neighbors into suspects. Inside the cells, reality sank in slowly. John's size and reputation meant little in the confines of interrogation rooms. He was grilled for hours, accused outright, told that others were pointing the finger at him. He denied it over and over, but the questions never stopped. Tony's laughter faded under the same treatment. He asked again and again how this could be happening, why his name was even on their lips. No answer ever came that made sense. Ronnie, quieter, was shaken, his confusion written across his face. He didn't have the force of personality of his cousin John, and detectives pressed on that weakness. And Yusef, proud, indignant, argued his innocence loudly, his anger rising with every accusation. But anger was a dangerous thing in those rooms. To detectives, it didn't look like the frustration of an innocent man. It looked like the temper of a guilty one. Piece by piece, statements were shaped. Stephen's coerced words were written down, tidied up, presented as confessions that implicated not only himself but the others. Witnesses were leaned on, encouraged to remember things they hadn't seen. And slowly, a case began to form, not a case built on truth, but a case built on necessity. For Cardiff, the headlines told the story they wanted. Arrests made, suspects identified, progress achieved. For the men in the cells, it was the beginning of years stolen, reputations ruined, lives dismantled. What had started as a hunt for Lynette White's killer was now something very different. It was a performance, a show of justice that masked the absence of it. And for 5 men from Tiger Bay, the nightmare had only just begun. By the spring of 1988, the names were set in stone. Stephen Miller, John Actie, Ronnie Actie, Tony Paris, and Yusef Abdullahi. The Cardiff Five. In the eyes of the police, they were no longer just suspects. They were the story, the men who had killed Lynette White. For the rest of the city, the announcement landed with force. Newspapers splashed their faces across front pages. Some photos were old, some taken hastily, but each image carried the same implication. These are the men who did it. The public didn't hear the contradictions, the doubts, the lack of evidence. They saw the headlines. They read the words, "arrested for murder." And in that, the presumption of guilt took hold. But behind the headlines, inside the police station walls, the truth was far messier. The cornerstone of the case was Stephen Miller. He was the link, the man police claimed had confessed. But the tapes of his interrogation told a different story. They revealed hours upon hours of questioning, sometimes 8 hours in a single stretch. Detectives circling him with relentless precision, pressing the same questions over and over, feeding him details when his answers faltered. "Stephen, we know you were there." "I wasn't. But we've spoken to people who put you there." "I wasn't there." "Stephen, listen to me. We've got evidence. We've got statements. You need to tell the truth." "I am telling the truth." "Then why is everyone else saying something different?" The tactic was clear. Isolate him, undermine him, wear him down until denial seemed pointless. Each time Stephen cried, each time his stammer tangled his words, detectives told him it was guilt speaking. Each time he protested, they told him he was lying. First, he held out. He said he hadn't been near James Street. He said he didn't know why Lynette would have been there. He said he loved her, that he would never hurt her. But as the hours dragged on, as fatigue blurred the lines between memory and suggestion, cracks began to appear. When detectives slipped in details, the color of Lynette's coat, the position of her body, the time she was last seen, Stephen began to echo them back. "Yes, maybe she was wearing that. Yes, maybe I followed her. Yes, maybe I argued with her." And then, finally, "Yes, I was there." Those words, coaxed from exhaustion and fear, became the prosecution's gold. On paper, they were a confession. On tape, they sounded like a man breaking down. But once transcribed, the nuance was gone. In neat black letters, the words read like an admission of guilt. And once Stephen was in, the others could be pulled in too. Detectives asked him about John Actie, about Tony Paris, about Ronnie, about Yusef. First, Stephen said nothing, but the pressure mounted. He was told others had named him. He was told the only way forward was to tell the truth. And so, eventually, he repeated the names they fed him. Suddenly, there was a gang, a group of men, supposedly acting together, lured by violence, united in crime. Never mind that the men barely knew each other, that their lives intersected only loosely in the small world of Tiger Bay. In the logic of the investigation, their names together made sense. The case notes began to take shape. 5 men, 1 victim, a frenzy of violence explained as a collective act. A story was being written, and it did not matter that it was fiction. In Butetown, the community was reeling. Families who had lived side by side for generations now found themselves split by fear. Mothers whispered warnings to their sons. "Don't go out at night. Don't talk to police alone. Don't give them any reason to look at you." The feeling was suffocating, the sense that the Bay itself was on trial. And in the press, the narrative hardened. The Cardiff Five became a shorthand for violence, for criminality, for everything outsiders wanted to believe about Tiger Bay. The Docklands, once celebrated for their diversity, were painted again as dangerous, lawless, a place where a young woman could be slaughtered without conscience. The truth, that Lynette's real killer was still out there, faded beneath the noise. As the months rolled on, the case moved toward court. Prosecution lawyers prepared to argue that Stephen's words were proof enough, that the contradictions in his statements were not evidence of coercion but signs of guilt. Witnesses were lined up, some shaky, some unreliable, but all willing to place the men nearer to James Street than they had ever been. For the Cardiff Five, the reality set in. This was not just questioning. This was not just suspicion. This was the full weight of the state pressing down on them, determined to secure convictions. The nightmare that began with a knock at the door was now heading for the dock. The story the police built did not spring from evidence. It was assembled piece by piece, like a puzzle where the picture was decided before the pieces were fitted. Each gap was filled not with proof, but with suggestion, pressure, and the words of people coaxed to say what detectives needed. Stephen Miller was the centerpiece. His so-called confession, torn from him after more than 300 hours of interrogation, became the cornerstone of the case. On tape, his words stammered, halting, contradictory. At one moment he denied everything, at the next he agreed to details he had been told by detectives. To any neutral ear it was confusion, not confession. But in the transcripts, stripped of tone and exhaustion, the words became deadly. Prosecutors had something they could point to, an admission, and in the eyes of the law that was powerful, even if it had been born of fear. But a confession alone was not enough. To build a convincing case, they needed witnesses, and so the search turned outward, toward the streets of Cardiff, toward anyone who might be persuaded or pressured to say they had seen something. That was how false testimonies were born. Some were offered deals, lighter treatment for their own charges if they played along. Others were coaxed with the suggestion that helping would keep them safe. A few were simply mistaken, their uncertainty polished into certainty by the time it reached the courtroom. One man claimed he saw the group together on the night of the murder, lingering near James Street. Another swore he overheard a drunken admission. Each account was flimsy, contradicted by other evidence, but woven together they created a tapestry. Fragile, yes, but one that looked convincing enough to present to a jury. Meanwhile, the press machine turned relentlessly. Cardiff's tabloids painted the Cardiff Five as violent thugs, men who prowled the bay looking for trouble. Words like gang and pack appeared in headlines, language designed to conjure fear. Photographs of the men, snapped outside police stations, heads bowed, hands cuffed, became symbols of menace. To the public, the trial seemed a foregone conclusion. A prostitute murdered in a frenzied attack. A group of men from the docks arrested, one of them confessing. Witnesses prepared to testify. It had the shape of a classic crime story, and no one wanted to look too closely at the cracks. Inside the bay, though, people saw it differently. Families knew these men. They knew their flaws, yes, the tempers, the bravado, the brushes with petty crime. But they also knew their humanity. They knew John's pride as a new father, Tony's jokes, Ronnie's quiet loyalty, Yusef's hard work. They knew Stephen's love for Lynette, clumsy but real. None of it fit the image of a gang slaughtering a young woman. But in the climate of 1980s Britain, with racial tensions running high and trust in the police already fractured, the truth mattered less than the narrative. And the narrative was set. The Cardiff Five were killers. As the months passed, the men sat in cells, their lives on hold, their families scrambling to cope. Letters were exchanged, visits arranged, but the separation gnawed at them. Children grew up without fathers. Partners struggled alone. The stigma spread like poison. To be connected to the Cardiff Five was to carry suspicion yourself. For Lynette White's family, the pain was doubled. Not only had they lost a daughter in the most brutal way imaginable, but they now found themselves thrust into a trial that promised justice but delivered only confusion. They wanted the truth. They wanted the man who killed Lynette. But what they were about to witness was something else entirely. By late 1989, the case was ready. The prosecution had its confession, its witnesses, its narrative of a group attack. The defense had little more than the men's denials and the obvious inconsistencies in the evidence. But in the climate of the time, denials sounded hollow, and inconsistencies were brushed aside. The trial was set to begin. In the dock, 5 men would stand accused of one of the most savage murders Cardiff had ever seen. And in the courtroom, the machinery of injustice would were into motion, powerful, relentless, and devastating. The trial began in the autumn of 1989, more than a year after Lynette White's death. Cardiff Crown Court, with its imposing stone columns and echoing chambers, became the stage for what the press had already branded the Valentine's Day murder trial. From the very first day, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters jostled for seats, their notebooks ready, cameras flashing as the defendants were led into the dock. Families of the accused sat in tight rows, their faces tense, while Lynette's relatives braced themselves for the painful details about to be replayed in public. The prosecution opened with force. They painted a picture of a young woman lured to her death, attacked in a frenzy of violence by a gang of men. The motive, they claimed, was rooted in jealousy and rage. Stephen Miller, they said, had been rejected by Lynette, and in his fury he led others to kill her. The jurors listened as the prosecution promised to prove this story with confessions, with witnesses, with testimony that placed the 5 men at the scene. What they did not hear was how fragile, how coerced, how contradictory that so-called evidence really was. The tapes of Stephen Miller's interrogation were played in court. Hour after hour, the jury heard his voice stammering, pleading, breaking under pressure. His words were scattered, inconsistent, shifting from denial to admission and back again. To some, it sounded like confusion, to others like manipulation, but to the prosecution it was gold. They seized on the fragments where Stephen seemed to admit involvement, ignoring the hours of denial. Listen to his own words, the prosecutor urged. He places himself at the scene. He admits to being there. This is not speculation. This is confession. The defense argued otherwise. They pointed to the length of the interviews, to Stephen's vulnerability, to the way detectives fed him details. They argued it was not confession but coercion, the collapse of a man too fragile to resist the relentless pressure. But the defense was fighting uphill. The prosecution had more than the tapes. They had witnesses. One after another, men and women took the stand to claim they had seen or heard something linking the 5 to the murder. Some swore they'd seen them near James Street. Others claimed they overheard drunken boasts. One insisted he remembered details from that night, though his timeline shifted each time he was questioned. Individually, each witness was shaky. Cross-examination revealed contradictions, lapses in memory, motives to lie. But together, woven into the prosecution's narrative, they created the illusion of certainty. The defense tore at the fabric where they could. They highlighted the lack of forensic evidence, the absence of fingerprints, the fact that not a single trace linked the 5 men to the scene. They argued that the case was built on sand, on unreliable testimony and a confession extracted under duress. But in the courtroom, the optics were powerful. 5 men in the dock, a young woman dead, a grieving family desperate for justice, a community already cast as dangerous in the public imagination. The prosecution's story fit too neatly, too perfectly, to be dismissed. As the weeks wore on, the toll grew heavier. For the Cardiff Five, each day was a blur of accusations and denials, of watching their lives dissected by strangers. For their families, it was agony to see loved ones paraded as monsters. And for Lynette's parents, the ordeal reopened wounds that had never healed, forcing them to listen to the brutal details of their daughter's last hours. By the time the trial neared its end, the weight of expectation was crushing. The jury had heard weeks of evidence, but the broader story, the confession, the witnesses, the narrative of a gang attack, loomed larger than the doubts. And when the verdicts came, they landed like hammer blows. Stephen Miller, guilty. Tony Paris, guilty. Yusef Abdullahi, guilty. Life sentences, For John and Ronnie Actie, the jury failed to reach agreement. They were acquitted, but acquittal did not bring freedom from stigma. To many, the shadow of suspicion clung to them regardless. As the three men were led away to begin life sentences for a crime they had not committed, the press declared victory. Justice had been done, they said. Lynette White's killers had been caught. But inside Tiger Bay, the mood was not relief. It was despair, because those who lived there knew what the court had refused to see. The real killer was still out there. And for the three men sent to prison, the nightmare had only just begun. The sound of the judge's gavel still echoed in their ears as Stephen Miller, Tony Paris, and Yusef Abdullahi were led down from the dock. The weight of the guilty verdicts settled on them like chains. For each man, the words life sentence were not just a legal ruling. They were the obliteration of everything they had known. For Stephen, it was devastation piled upon devastation. He had lost Lynette, the woman he loved, in the most brutal way imaginable. And now he was branded her killer. The irony was unbearable. The man who had wept at her grave was now condemned as the one who put her there. Prison swallowed him whole. His stammer, already mocked outside, became a target behind bars. He was isolated, vulnerable, tormented not only by inmates who believed he was guilty but by his own relentless grief. His mind circled endlessly around the question. How had it come to this? Tony Paris, once the Joker of Tiger Bay, found his laughter silenced. Behind the prison gates, humor was no shield. He missed his family, his friends, the small comforts of freedom. His mother, who believed fiercely in his innocence, visited when she could, but each visit ended with the same heartbreak, leaving her son behind. Yusef Abdullahi, proud and outspoken, carried himself with defiance. He insisted to anyone who would listen that he was innocent. But defiance came at a cost. Inmates saw arrogance. Officers saw trouble. And Yusef, like the others, endured the slow grind of prison life with bitterness etched into his bones. For John and Ronnie Actie, acquitted but not free, life was no easier. They walked out of court technically cleared, but the stain of accusation clung to them. Neighbors whispered. Employers hesitated. The words murder suspect were not easily erased. Their lives, too, had been shattered, even without prison walls to hold them. Outside the prison gates, the world moved on. For many in Cardiff, the case was closed. The press declared justice done. Lynette White's killer had been caught, tried, and convicted. To reopen the question would be to admit a mistake. And mistakes in justice were not things the system liked to acknowledge. But inside Tiger Bay, the conviction rang hollow. Families who knew the men who had lived alongside them refused to accept the story the court had told. They knew the flaws in the evidence, the coercion in Stephen's so-called confession, the contradictions in the witnesses' statements. They knew in their bones that the wrong men were behind bars. It was in living rooms and community halls that the first sparks of resistance were lit. Mothers, partners, friends gathered to ask the questions the court had ignored. Why was there no forensic evidence? Why did the witnesses change their stories? Why had Stephen's hours of denial been brushed aside in favor of a few broken admissions? From those questions grew a campaign. It was small at first, fragile, dismissed by many as hopeless. But it was persistent. Pamphlets were printed. Meetings were held. Journalists were approached. Lawyers willing to listen were found. Piece by piece, the cracks in the case were exposed to anyone willing to look. It was a long road, and in the early years, progress was painfully slow. The justice system was built to preserve convictions, not overturn them. Appeals were rejected, dismissed with cold words about jury verdicts and finality. But the campaigners refused to give up. They knew that truth, however buried, had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. For the Cardiff Three, the years stretched on. Birthdays were missed. Children grew up. Relationships crumbled. Each man coped in his own way. Stephen retreating inward, Tony clinging to hope, Yusef raging against the injustice. And yet, even as the walls closed in, the fight outside was growing. Journalists began to take notice. Human rights groups lent their voices. The phrase miscarriage of justice began to circulate. What had once seemed unthinkable, that 3 innocent men were rotting in prison for a crime they did not commit, was slowly becoming undeniable. The road to freedom was still far away, but the first cracks had been struck in the wall. The prison sentences were meant to be the end of the story, but almost immediately, the appeals process began. For the Cardiff Three, it was the one sliver of hope, that a higher court might see what the Crown Court jury had missed, that someone might listen without prejudice to the flaws in the case. The lawyers gathered transcripts, interrogations, statements, the bones of the prosecution's narrative. What they found was a web of contradictions. Stephen Miller's so-called confession had been pulled from him after more than 300 hours of questioning. His stammer exploited, his grief manipulated. The words on tape were not the clear-cut admission the prosecution had claimed. They were fragments of a man broken down by pressure. The witnesses, too, were unreliable. Their accounts shifted with each retelling. Some admitted to drinking heavily on the night in question. Others contradicted not only themselves but each other. What had been presented in court as a consistent story was, in reality, a patchwork stitched together from shaky recollections and suggestions planted by investigators. The defense lawyers argued all of this at the Court of Appeal. They laid bare the hours of coercion, the inconsistencies, the absence of forensic evidence. They pointed out the obvious. Not a single fingerprint, not a single drop of blood, not a single trace of the Cardiff Three had been found at 7 James Street. How, then, could the jury have been so certain? But the appeals judges were unmoved. The jury had reached a verdict, they said, and that verdict carried weight. The supposed confession, flawed though it was, remained powerful in the eyes of the law. The witnesses, contradictory though they were, had been heard and believed. And so, in cold legal language, the appeals were dismissed. For the men inside, it was crushing. Years stretched ahead of them, the walls closing tighter. The idea that truth alone could set them free was revealed to be an illusion. The system was not built to admit mistakes. It was built to defend its verdicts. Yet outside the prison gates, the campaign did not stop. Families continued to fight, printing leaflets, writing letters, calling on anyone who would listen. Journalists began to take up the cause, probing deeper into the cracks of the case. A few brave voices in the media dared to suggest what many already knew in Butetown, that the Cardiff Three were innocent men, victims of a grotesque miscarriage of justice. One of those journalists was the young investigative reporter who sat through the trial and could not shake the unease he felt. The evidence hadn't added up then, and it still didn't add up now. He began digging, asking questions, poring over the transcripts. What he found only deepened his conviction. Something had gone terribly wrong. The campaign grew slowly, gathering momentum. Human rights groups added their voices, drawing parallels to other infamous miscarriages of justice in Britain, the Birmingham Six, the Guildford Four. Cardiff's shame was not unique. It was part of a larger pattern. A justice system too quick to convict, too proud to admit error. For the Cardiff Three, hope flickered. Letters from supporters reached them in their cells, reminding them that they had not been forgotten. Each appeal rejection was a blow, but each new ally was a lifeline. And in the background, something else lingered. The knowledge that Lynette White's real killer was still free. While 3 innocent men rotted in prison, the true murderer walked among them, unseen, unpunished. That truth hung over every visit, every letter, every campaign meeting. The system had delivered its verdict. But the fight for justice was only just beginning. The 1990s opened with 3 men in prison and a city trying to forget. Officially, the case of Lynette White was closed. Justice, according to the courts, had been served. But in Butetown, and in the small but determined circles of campaigners, the fight for truth was alive. The campaign for the Cardiff Three was not glamorous. It wasn't funded by wealthy donors or driven by political clout. It was carried on the backs of families, friends, and a handful of journalists and lawyers who refused to let go. They printed leaflets on borrowed photocopiers, organized marches through the streets of Cardiff, and stood outside courts holding signs that read "Free the Cardiff Three." At first, they were ignored. To the wider public, the story had already been told and finished. But then came comparisons. The names of other wrongful convictions were whispered alongside Cardiff's. The Birmingham Six, the Guildford Four. Both groups had been convicted of IRA bombings, both groups later proven innocent. If the justice system could fail so catastrophically in those cases, why not here? The parallels were too strong to dismiss. And slowly, journalists began to circle back. They reread the trial transcripts, they studied the interrogation tapes, and what they found disturbed them deeply. Stephen Miller's so-called confession, once presented as damning, now looked unmistakably like a product of psychological torture. His stammering pleas, his exhaustion, his repeated denials. How had any of it been mistaken for truth? The media began to shift. Small articles grew into features. Questions were asked in Parliament. The words "miscarriage of justice" began to cling to the Cardiff Three like a shadow. Meanwhile, inside prison walls, the men endured. Stephen withdrew deeper into himself, the weight of Lynette's loss pressing harder each year. Tony tried to hold on to hope, clutching letters from supporters and family. Yusef seethed, his anger at the injustice burning hot, sometimes too hot, earning him punishments from prison officers. But beyond those walls, the campaign refused to die. Human rights organizations picked up the case. Lawyers who had once shrugged it off began to reconsider. And in 1992, the first major breakthrough came. The Court of Appeal agreed to hear new evidence. It was not an easy road. The appeal judges remained skeptical, reluctant to admit the system had failed. But the cracks in the prosecution's case were too glaring to ignore. Witnesses were called again, their testimonies picked apart, their contradictions laid bare. The methods of the police were scrutinized. The interrogations of Stephen Miller were finally seen for what they were: coercive, oppressive, and fundamentally unjust. And then, at last, the convictions were quashed. In December 1992, the Court of Appeal declared the guilty verdicts against Stephen Miller, Tony Paris, and Yusef Abdullahi unsafe. The Cardiff Three walked free. For their families, it was vindication. For the men themselves, it was liberation. But it was not triumph. They stepped out of prison to find lives shattered, years stolen, reputations ruined. Freedom did not erase the damage. And more importantly, the quashing of their convictions did not answer the central question. Who had killed Lynette White? The police, embarrassed, tried to frame the moment as closure. The convictions had been unsafe, they admitted, but the investigation was over. They insisted there was no prospect of finding the real killer. But others were not so willing to let it rest. Journalists, lawyers, and campaigners demanded accountability. If the Cardiff Three were innocent, then who was guilty? If the police had pursued the wrong men, then who had been protected? And beneath it all, an even darker question began to stir. Had this been incompetence or corruption? The 1990s would not be the end of the Lynette White story. They would be the beginning of something bigger. Something that would shake the very foundations of British policing. When the Court of Appeal quashed the convictions of the Cardiff Three in December 1992, the ruling landed like a thunderclap. For the families, it was vindication. For the men themselves, it was the first breath of freedom after years of suffocation. But for the South Wales police, it was humiliation. A public acknowledgement that their case, once hailed as a victory, was rotten at the core. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Stephen Miller stumbled out of prison, pale and broken, his body free but his spirit scarred. He had gone in as a grieving boyfriend, accused of killing the woman he loved. He came out labeled the man wrongly convicted, but that did not erase the damage. His name would forever be linked to Lynette's death. Tony Paris tried to smile, to embrace his family, to make light of the lost years. But the strain showed in his eyes. He had missed birthdays, funerals, countless everyday moments that could never be reclaimed. Yusef Abdullahi carried himself with defiance. Chest out, voice loud, telling reporters that justice had finally prevailed. But the anger inside him was volcanic, bubbling with every thought of the years stolen. For John and Ronnie Actie, who had never been convicted but had lived under suspicion since 1988, the ruling offered little comfort. They, too, had lost nearly everything: work, relationships, the chance at a normal life. The court had set the men free, but it had not offered them peace. And then came the bigger question: what next? The South Wales police insisted that the quashing of the convictions was not the same as proving innocence. It simply meant the verdicts were unsafe. They announced no plans to reopen the case. No new suspects were pursued. The implication was chilling. Lynette's murder might remain forever unsolved. But journalists, campaigners, and lawyers refused to accept that. They demanded answers. How had the police built a case on coerced confessions and unreliable witnesses? How had prosecutors presented such flimsy evidence with a straight face? And most damning of all, had this been incompetence or deliberate corruption? The parallels to other miscarriages of justice were unavoidable. Britain was in the middle of reckoning with its failures: the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, the Maguire 7. In each case, police had cut corners, bent rules, even fabricated evidence to secure convictions. Was Cardiff just another chapter in the same shameful story? In Tiger Bay, suspicion was already certain. People who had lived under the glare of police scrutiny for generations didn't see the Cardiff Five Case as an aberration. They saw it as confirmation. To them, the men had not been wrongly accused by accident. They had been targeted because they were convenient, because they were black, because they were from the Bay. Pressure mounted. The media kept digging. Television documentaries revisited the case, playing clips of Stephen Miller's interrogations for the public. Viewers were shocked. What once looked like a confession now looked like bullying, a man broken by psychological pressure. The outrage grew, and finally, begrudgingly, the authorities acted. An inquiry was launched. At first, it was narrow, focused only on procedural errors. But as investigators pulled at the threads, the scale of the rot became impossible to ignore. Witnesses admitted they had been pressured. Officers admitted details had been suggested. Records revealed inconsistencies. What emerged was not simply a flawed investigation. It was a manufactured case, a conviction built not on evidence but on lies. By the late 1990s, the cracks had widened into a chasm. South Wales police, once celebrated for solving the Valentine's Day murder, now stood accused of orchestrating one of the worst miscarriages of justice in British history. But even as the walls began to close on the officers involved, one truth remained unresolved. Lynette White was still dead, and her real killer had never been found. That question, long buried beneath layers of lies and cover-ups, was about to resurface. And this time science, not storytelling, would provide the answer. By the end of the 1990s, the case of the Cardiff Five had become a national scandal. The convictions had been quashed. The men were free, but their lives were ruined. The police force that had built the case stood accused of corruption. And yet, one question still echoed louder than all the rest. Who had killed Lynette White? For years, it seemed the answer would never come. The investigation had been poisoned, the evidence compromised, the truth buried beneath decades of lies. But then, quietly, another force began to stir science. Forensic technology was advancing at a pace no one could have imagined in 1988. DNA profiling, still in its infancy at the time of Lynette's murder, had become sharper, more precise, more powerful. Cold cases across Britain were being re-examined with this new tool, and one by one, long-forgotten mysteries were being solved. In 2000, a decision was made to revisit the evidence from 7 James Street. The crime scene had been a bloody one, chaotic and gruesome, and in that chaos, countless samples had been collected and stored. For more than a decade, those samples had sat in storage, untested or unanalyzed. Now, they were re-examined with the latest DNA techniques. What the scientists found was extraordinary. Among the chaos of blood and fibers, a clear DNA profile emerged. Not of Stephen Miller, not of Tony Paris, not of Yusef Abdullahi, not of John or Ronnie Actie. The profile belonged to someone else entirely. That someone was Jeffrey Gafoor. Gafoor was not one of the original suspects. His name had never been shouted in the police station corridors during the frantic weeks of 1988. But when his DNA was run through the system, the match was undeniable. The odds of it being anyone else were astronomical. His blood had been found at the murder scene. His DNA was the silent witness that had waited more than a decade to speak. Gafoor was tracked down, questioned, and confronted with the evidence. At first, he denied everything, but the science was unrelenting. Eventually, faced with the truth, he confessed. He had killed Lynette White on Valentine's Day, 1988. The motive, he admitted, was tragically banal: a dispute over money. Lynette, working as a sex worker, had argued with Gafoor over payment. The confrontation escalated. In a fit of rage, he attacked her. The violence was frenzied, uncontrolled, leaving the scene as the police had first found it: a bloodbath. For the families of the Cardiff Five, the revelation was both vindication and agony. Vindication because it proved what they had always known, that the men were innocent. Agony because it took more than 15 years to get there. 15 years of prison time, stigma, ruined lives, all for a crime committed by someone else. For Lynette's family, the confession was devastating in a different way. They had spent years trapped in a cycle of false justice, forced to endure a trial that blamed the wrong men. Now, the truth was out, but it came too late to undo the damage. And for South Wales Police, the DNA breakthrough was catastrophic. The entire foundation of their case against the Cardiff Five had collapsed. They could no longer claim error or oversight. They had pursued the wrong men while the real killer walked free, and only science, not their own investigation, had exposed the truth. The arrest of Jeffrey Gafoor did more than solve a murder. It unleashed a reckoning, because if the Cardiff Three were innocent, and the police had known the evidence against them was flawed, then what did that say about the officers who built the case? The answer would come soon, in the form of one of the largest police corruption trials in British history. Jeffrey Gafoor's confession should have been the end of the story. The real killer had been caught. The Cardiff Three were proven innocent. Justice, belatedly, had been done. But the truth is never so simple, because while Gafoor's DNA solved the murder, it also exposed something darker, something that could not be ignored. The Cardiff Five had not simply been victims of mistake. They had been victims of fabrication. The spotlight turned back on South Wales Police. The question was no longer who killed Lynette White. It was who framed 5 innocent men for her death. The evidence was staggering. Witnesses had been pressured into changing their stories. Some admitted outright that they had lied on oath, pushed by detectives to remember details that fit the narrative. Statements had been rewritten, timelines altered. And at the heart of it all was the coerced confession of Stephen Miller. Hours upon hours of interrogation until his words collapsed into something that could be shaped into guilt. This was not sloppy policing. This was corruption. In 2003, the Crown Prosecution Service took the unprecedented step of charging former detectives from the original investigation. They were accused of perverting the course of justice, one of the gravest charges that can be laid against police officers. The trial that followed was historic. Never before had so many officers faced such allegations in connection with a single case. Detectives who once strutted through the courtroom as enforcers of the law now sat in the dock, their reputations shredded. The prosecution laid out a devastating case. The Cardiff Five had been fitted up, plain and simple. The confession had been coerced. The witnesses had been manipulated. The investigation had been driven not by truth, but by desperation, and perhaps by prejudice. For weeks, the trial gripped the nation. Journalists filled the court, families packed the gallery. The Cardiff Five, scarred but free, watched as the tables turned on the men who had destroyed their lives. And yet, just when it seemed justice was finally within reach, the case collapsed. After months of testimony, the corruption trial ended without convictions. The complexity of the case, the years that had passed, the tangled web of lies and retractions. It all proved too much. The officers walked free, their careers ruined but their liberty intact. For the Cardiff Five and their families, it was another cruel twist. They had waited decades for accountability, only to see it slip away in a haze of legal technicalities. But the damage to public trust was irreversible. The collapse of the corruption trial did not clear the officers' names in the eyes of the public. If anything, it deepened suspicion. People saw what had happened for what it was. A miscarriage of justice so vast that the system itself recoiled from holding its architects accountable. South Wales Police, once so proud of their solution to Lynette White's murder, were now infamous for one of the worst scandals in British policing. The name Cardiff Five had become shorthand for corruption, racism, and the abuse of power. And through it all, the human cost remained unbearable. Lynette White was still dead. Her family had endured years of false justice before the real killer was found. The Cardiff Five had lost decades of freedom, trust, and dignity. Communities had been torn apart. This was no longer just the story of a single murder. It was the story of a justice system tested to breaking point, and of the people who refused to be silenced, even when the truth seemed impossible to reach. When the corruption trial collapsed, it felt like the end of the line. The police officers who had orchestrated one of the gravest miscarriages of justice in British history would face no punishment. The system had once again protected its own. But for those left behind, the Cardiff Five, their families, and Lynette's loved ones, life went on, heavy with scars. For Stephen Miller, freedom had never meant peace. The years in prison had broken him. His speech, already marked by a stammer, carried the tremble of trauma. Crowds terrified him. Journalists who shoved microphones in his face only deepened his sense of exposure. He carried a double burden, grieving Lynette while forever tied to her murder. For many, his name would always be linked unfairly to her death. He lived the rest of his days in the margins, a man freed by law but imprisoned by memory. Tony Paris returned to his family, determined to reclaim something of a normal life. He tried to work, tried to smile, tried to rebuild. But the years lost could never be restored. His mother, who had campaigned tirelessly, became his anchor, her voice ringing with defiance whenever anyone dared suggest her son had been anything but innocent. Tony carried himself with quiet resilience, but the weight of injustice was etched into his every day. Yusef Abdullahi, loud and proud, struggled most with the aftermath. His anger, justified though it was, consumed him. He lashed out at the system, at the state, at anyone who dared dismiss the years stolen from him. He wanted accountability, retribution, answers, but instead he found only silence. His health deteriorated. His spirit, once fiery, dimmed under the strain of endless frustration. For John and Ronnie Actie, acquitted at trial but forever branded by suspicion, the stain never faded. Employers remembered, neighbors whispered, strangers pointed. To them, the words "not guilty" had never carried the same weight as "innocent." They lived in a twilight of partial vindication, their lives disrupted beyond repair. And then there was Lynette's family. For them, the ordeal was unbearable in a different way. They had been forced to watch as the wrong men were dragged through the courts, as the media spun lies, as the truth of their daughter's murder was obscured for more than a decade. When Jeffrey Gafoor finally confessed, it did not bring healing. It only reopened wounds. They had been robbed not only of Lynette, but of the dignity of a true and timely justice. In Butetown, the case became a scar on the community. To many, it confirmed what they had always believed, that the police did not see them as citizens, but as suspects. The Cardiff Five were not convicted because of evidence. They were convicted because they were black, mixed race, and from the Bay. Trust, already fragile, was shattered. The state attempted to make amends in the only way it knew: money. Compensation was awarded to the Cardiff Three, running into hundreds of thousands of pounds each. But money could not buy back lost years, could not repair reputations, could not erase nightmares. For some, the payouts felt like hush money, a way to settle accounts without ever addressing the deeper truth. And yet, Even in the midst of devastation, voices rose. Campaigners who had fought for years refused to stop. They demanded reform, accountability, systemic change. They pointed to the Cardiff case as proof of the dangers of unchecked police power, of coerced confessions, of racism woven into the fabric of justice. For South Wales Police, the case was a wound that never healed. They issued apologies, spoke of lessons learned, promised reforms. But for many, those words rang hollow. The same institution that had once framed innocent men could not easily be trusted to police itself. The Cardiff Five Case became more than just a story of one murder. It became a symbol, a warning, a case study in how easily truth can be twisted, how fragile justice can be when power goes unchecked. And even decades later, its echoes lingered. In every conversation about miscarriages of justice, in every debate about police accountability, in every community where trust in authority was brittle. Because the story of Lynette White and the Cardiff Five was not just about the past. It was, and remains, a lesson for the present. The story of Lynette White and the Cardiff Five was not just about one crime, one trial, or one police force. It was about Britain itself in the late 20th century, a country struggling with questions of race, power, and trust in its institutions. To understand the case fully, you have to understand Cardiff. Tiger Bay was unlike anywhere else in Britain. A melting pot born of the docks, it was home to families from Somalia, Yemen, Jamaica, Ireland, Malta, and beyond. It was a place where children grew up speaking in accents their parents had never heard, where cultures blended on street corners, where difference was the norm. But to outsiders and to authority, Tiger Bay was other. It was exoticized, demonized, and too often criminalized. Newspapers described it in tones of suspicion, hinting at danger, immorality, lawlessness. Police officers who patrolled its streets often carried those same prejudices, seeing the community not as citizens to be protected but as suspects to be controlled. Against that backdrop, the Cardiff Five were not random men caught in the net. They were convenient. They were from the Bay, they were black or mixed race, and in the eyes of the police that made them plausible killers. Evidence didn't matter as much as narrative, and the narrative fit neatly into the prejudices of the time. The use of coerced confessions, too, reflected a deeper rot. In the 1980s, the idea of psychological pressure was only beginning to be understood in British policing. There were few safeguards. Interrogations could run for hours, even days, without proper legal oversight. Vulnerable suspects, like Stephen Miller, with his stammer and his grief, were easy prey. His words became clay in the hands of detectives desperate for results. The Cardiff case also revealed the dangerous relationship between police and press. Reporters hungry for headlines repeated police narratives uncritically. They painted the accused as guilty long before a jury had spoken. Public opinion hardened. The Cardiff Five became a household name for all the wrong reasons, and the men's reputations were destroyed before they had a chance to defend themselves. When the truth finally surfaced through DNA, not diligent investigation, it exposed more than police corruption. It showed how fragile justice can be when institutions close ranks, when prejudice shapes decisions, when accountability is absent. The case also spoke to a broader pattern. Britain in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was riddled with miscarriages of justice. The Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, the Maguire 7, cases where confessions were beaten, bullied, or tricked out of suspects. Cases where juries were persuaded by narratives rather than evidence. Cases where entire communities, Irish, black, working class, were cast as villains because they were convenient scapegoats. The Cardiff Five became part of that grim lineage. But they also helped expose it. Their case, like the others, forced Britain to confront its failures. It sparked debates about policing, led to reforms in how interrogations were conducted, highlighted the dangers of institutional racism. Yet the lessons were bitter. Reforms came slowly. Trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt. In Butetown, many still felt and still feel that justice is not blind, that it sees race and poverty all too clearly. The Cardiff case was a tragedy layered upon tragedy. The brutal death of Lynette White, the wrongful convictions of 5 innocent men, the wasted years, the corruption that went unpunished. But it was also a mirror, held up to Britain, forcing it to see itself as it was. A nation whose justice system was not immune to prejudice, power, and failure. And that reflection, uncomfortable though it was, became the true legacy of the case. Freedom came late, and it came at a cost. For the Cardiff Five, the years after release were not a return to normality. They were an attempt to live in the shadow of something that could never be undone. Stephen Miller struggled the most. Prison had hollowed him out. The long hours of interrogation had left their mark, scars that no compensation could heal. He withdrew from public life, avoiding cameras and interviews. Crowds unsettled him. The sound of his own name in newspapers or television reports felt like a curse. He had been Lynette's boyfriend, her companion in life, but history had branded him as her accused killer. That stain never washed away. Tony Paris carried himself with quiet dignity. He tried to rebuild, working when he could, surrounding himself with family who had never doubted him. But the years lost weighed heavy. He had missed his daughter's early childhood, missed family milestones, missed the chance at the ordinary life he once dreamed of. Tony rarely spoke with anger, but those close to him saw the sadness behind his smile, the grief for time that could never be returned. Yusef Abdullahi never shook the rage. He had always been outspoken, never afraid to tell the truth as he saw it. But after his release, the injustice consumed him. He railed against the police, the courts, the system that had stolen years from him. His health faltered. Friends described him as a man still fighting battles that had ended on paper but never ended in his heart. In 2011, Yusef died suddenly. He went to his grave carrying the weight of innocence unacknowledged, accountability denied. For Ronnie Actie, acquitted at trial but dragged through years of suspicion, freedom was bittersweet. He was spared prison but not stigma. Employers hesitated. Neighbors whispered. Reporters remembered. John became an advocate, telling his story publicly, determined to ensure others understood the damage done. His resilience was remarkable, but he, too, carried the burden of being branded a suspect in a crime he had nothing to do with. Ronnie Actie retreated from the spotlight. Like John, he had been acquitted, but his life was scarred all the same. He returned to his community, tried to keep his head down, but the echoes of the case followed him everywhere. In the Bay, everyone remembered. The state eventually awarded compensation, hundreds of thousands of pounds each. But money was a poor substitute for dignity, for reputation, for years lost behind bars. Some invested, some squandered, some tried to use the payouts as a foundation to start again. None of it erased the damage. The Cardiff Five became symbols, names forever attached to one of Britain's worst miscarriages of justice. For some, that gave them purpose. For others, it was a chain they could never shake. And in every life, Lynette White's ghost remained. She was the victim at the center of it all, the young woman whose murder should have been solved with honesty and diligence. Instead, her death became the spark for decades of injustice, corruption, and pain. Her name, too, was forever entangled with the Cardiff Five. A cruel twist that meant even in her memory, justice was complicated. In later years, documentaries, articles, and even dramas retold the story. For the men, seeing their lives replayed on screen was surreal, part vindication, part reopening of old wounds. They were finally recognized as innocent, yet constantly reminded of the years stolen. The Cardiff Five never truly escaped the case. How could they? It had defined them, consumed them, and in many ways destroyed them. They lived the rest of their lives as free men, but not as whole men. And through their pain, Britain was forced to ask itself an uncomfortable question. If this could happen in Cardiff, how many other stories like it remained untold? In the storm of trials, appeals, police corruption, and wrongful convictions, it is easy to lose sight of the person at the heart of this case. Lynette White, a young woman whose life was brutally cut short on Valentine's Day, 1988. Lynette was just 20 years old when she died. She grew up in Cardiff, part of a working-class family, raised in a city where opportunity was scarce and survival often meant compromise. Those who knew her described her as warm, gentle, and soft-spoken, but also vulnerable. She had struggled with life's hardships from an early age, and by her teenage years, she had slipped into a world that carried both risk and danger. Sex work. For Lynette, it was a way to survive, a way to make money in a city that offered little else for young women like her. But survival came at a cost. It put her in the path of men who saw her not as a person, but as a commodity. It exposed her to violence, to danger, to a life lived on the edge of respectability and, too often, safety. Yet Lynette was not defined by that. To those who loved her, she was more than the label of sex worker. She was a daughter, a friend, a girlfriend to Stephen Miller, a young woman with dreams that stretched beyond the narrow streets of Butetown. Those who remember her speak of her kindness, of her laughter, of the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the stigma she faced. She was, in many ways, like countless other young women of her generation, navigating a world that was not always kind, trying to carve out a place for herself, searching for stability. On the night of February 14, 1988, Lynette's life was stolen from her in an act of frenzied violence. The brutality of her death shocked even hardened detectives. But the cruelty did not end there. In the years that followed, her memory was buried beneath layer upon layer of injustice. Instead of being honored, she was reduced to a detail in a miscarriage of justice. Her name became a headline, her humanity eclipsed by the spectacle of trials and false convictions. It is vital to remember that Lynette was not just a victim of murder. She was a victim of neglect, by a society that offered her too few choices, by a justice system that turned her death into a stage for corruption, and by a narrative that too often forgot her in its obsession with scandal. When Jeffrey Gafoor finally confessed, it revealed the truth of what happened that night. It was not a gang of 5 men. It was not a conspiracy. It was one man, one argument over money, one eruption of violence. Lynette's life ended not because of some elaborate plot, but because she was vulnerable, and because Gafoor's rage was unchecked. Her family carried that truth with them. They fought not only for justice, but for her memory. To remind the world that she was more than the Valentine's Day murder victim. That she had lived, that she had loved, that she had mattered. In the years since, those who tell the Cardiff Five story have tried to bring Lynette back into focus. Documentaries, articles, and books increasingly emphasize her humanity, her life, not just her death. Because to truly honor her, we must see her not as a case file, but as a person. The tragedy of Lynette White is not only that she was murdered. It is that in death, she became a symbol, and symbols, no matter how powerful, can never capture the fullness of a life lived. Her story deserves to be told alongside the injustice that followed. Because without remembering Lynette herself, the rest risks becoming just another tale of corruption and failure, instead of what it truly is. The loss of a young woman whose life was stolen, and whose memory deserves dignity. For more than a decade after Lynette White's death, the name Jeffrey Gafoor was unknown to the public. While 5 innocent men were dragged through courts, prisons, and headlines, Gafoor lived quietly, blending into the background of Cardiff life. Gafoor was not a notorious criminal. He had no dramatic history of violence that would have made him an obvious suspect in 1988. He was an ordinary man in appearance, in behavior, in the way he conducted his life. And that ordinariness was his camouflage. At the time of the murder, Gafoor was in his late 20s. He worked as a security guard, a job that placed him in a position of responsibility but not power. He was not wealthy, nor particularly ambitious. He was, by many accounts, unremarkable. Yet beneath that veneer of normality simmered an anger, a capacity for violence that would erupt on that February night. The motive was pitifully small. Gafoor had hired Lynette for sex. They argued over money. The sum disputed. The situation escalated. What should have been a heated exchange turned suddenly fatally violent. Gafoor lashed out with a knife and, in a frenzy, stabbed her more than 50 times. It was not planned. It was not calculated. It was an explosion of rage. And when it was over, Gafoor fled, leaving Lynette's blood-soaked body behind. That should have been the end of his freedom. In a just investigation, Gafoor's name would have surfaced quickly. But instead, the net of suspicion was cast wide across Tiger Bay. The police fixated on Stephen Miller and his circle. Evidence was bent to fit a theory. And in that vacuum, Gafoor vanished into obscurity, unnoticed, unchallenged, untouched. For years, he lived an ordinary life. He worked, he paid bills, he maintained relationships. All the while, the weight of his secret pressed down. He watched from the shadows as the Cardiff Five were arrested, tried, convicted. He saw men imprisoned for his crime, and he said nothing. It is hard to imagine the psychological toll of such silence. Did he feel relief, guilt, fear of discovery? Perhaps all three. But he remained hidden, shielded by the incompetence or worse, the willful blindness of the original investigation. The turning point came not through confession but through science. When investigators reopened the case in the early 2000s, new DNA techniques unlocked secrets the original detectives could not or would not uncover. Samples preserved from the scene yielded a clear genetic fingerprint. When it was run through the system, it pointed squarely at Gafoor. Confronted with the evidence, he broke. At first he denied. Then, slowly, the denial crumbled. Eventually, Gafoor confessed to what he had done all those years ago. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to Lynette White's murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The man who had once walked free while others rotted in cells was finally behind bars. But the timing mattered. His conviction did not undo the damage done to the Cardiff Five. It did not erase the years of wrongful imprisonment. It did not heal Lynette's family. In some ways, it deepened the wound, because it proved beyond doubt that the truth had always been there, waiting in the bloodstains, waiting in the science, waiting to be seen. Gafoor's name will never be remembered like the Cardiff Five. He is not the center of this story. He is its dark catalyst. A man whose violent act began a chain reaction of tragedy, injustice, and betrayal. And yet, his capture also represents the thin thread of hope. That truth, however delayed, can eventually surface. That science, impartial and unyielding, can succeed where human prejudice fails. Gafoor remains in prison, serving his life sentence. But the real sentence was carried by others. Men who bore his guilt for years, a family who mourned Lynette through false trials, and a community forever scarred by a crime that was his alone. When Jeffrey Gafoor finally confessed in 2003, the truth of Lynette White's murder was laid bare. But for many, catching the killer was only half the story. The deeper question remained. How had 5 innocent men been dragged through the courts for a crime they did not commit? The answer pointed back to South Wales police. For years, suspicions had swirled. Witnesses had recanted, admitting they were pressured to lie. Stephen Miller's so-called confession, once the centerpiece of the prosecution, was now widely seen as a textbook example of coercion. Files revealed alterations, inconsistencies, statements rewritten to match a preset theory. It was no longer possible to call this mere incompetence. The investigation into Lynette's murder had been corrupted from the inside. The Crown Prosecution Service took an extraordinary step, charging former detectives with perverting the course of justice. It was an unprecedented moment. The very officers who once commanded the courtroom now sat in the dock, accused of destroying lives in pursuit of a false conviction. The trial was immense in scale. More than a dozen former officers faced charges, alongside civilian witnesses accused of lying under oath. It was billed as the biggest police corruption case in British legal history. The stakes were enormous. Not just the fate of the officers, but the credibility of policing itself. In court, the prosecution laid out its case. They argued that detectives had been under pressure to solve Lynette's murder quickly. The city was demanding answers, the media circling, the Home Office watching. Faced with this pressure, officers had constructed a narrative, and then bent reality to fit it. Witnesses were coached, intimidated, or rewarded to give the right answers. Miller's confession was not a breakthrough but the product of hours of psychological battering. The Cardiff Five, they argued, were not suspects, they were scapegoats. On the night of February 14, 1988, Lynette's life was stolen from her in an act of frenzied violence. The brutality of her death shocked even hardened detectives. But the cruelty did not end there. In the years that followed, her memory was buried beneath layer upon layer of injustice. Instead of being honored, she was reduced to a detail in a miscarriage of justice. Her name became a headline, her humanity eclipsed by the spectacle of trials and false convictions. It is vital to remember that Lynette was not just a victim of murder. She was a victim of neglect, by a society that offered her too few choices, by a justice system that turned her death into a stage for corruption, and by a narrative that too often forgot her in its obsession with scandal. When Jeffrey Gafoor finally confessed, it revealed the truth of what happened that night. It was not a gang of 5 men. It was not a conspiracy. It was one man, one argument over money, one eruption of violence. Lynette's life ended not because of some elaborate plot, but because she was vulnerable, and because Gafoor's rage was unchecked. Her family carried that truth with them. They fought not only for justice, but for her memory. To remind the world that she was more than the Valentine's Day murder victim, that she had lived, that she had loved, that she had mattered. In the years since, those who tell the Cardiff Five story have tried to bring Lynette back into focus. Documentaries, articles, and books increasingly emphasize her humanity, her life, not just her death. Because to truly honor her, we must see her not as a case file, but as a person. The tragedy of Lynette White is not only that she was murdered. It is that in death, she became a symbol, and symbols, no matter how powerful, can never capture the fullness of a life lived. Her story deserves to be told alongside the injustice that followed. Because without remembering Lynette herself, the rest risks becoming just another tale of corruption and failure, instead of what it truly is: the loss of a young woman whose life was stolen and whose memory deserves dignity. For more than a decade after Lynette White's death, the name Jeffrey Gafoor was unknown to the public. While 5 innocent men were dragged through courts, prisons, and headlines, Gafoor lived quietly, blending into the background of Cardiff life. Gafoor was not a notorious criminal. He had no dramatic history of violence that would have made him an obvious suspect in 1988. He was an ordinary man in appearance, in behavior, in the way he conducted his life. And that ordinariness was his camouflage. At the time of the murder, Gafoor was in his late 20s. He worked as a security guard, a job that placed him in a position of responsibility but not power. He was not wealthy, nor particularly ambitious. He was, by many accounts, unremarkable. Yet beneath that veneer of normality simmered an anger, a capacity for violence that would erupt on that February night. The motive was pitifully small. Gafoor had hired Lynette for sex. They argued over money. The sum disputed. The situation escalated. What should have been a heated exchange turned suddenly, fatally violent. Gafoor lashed out with a knife, and in a frenzy, stabbed her more than 50 times. It was not planned. It was not calculated. It was an explosion of rage. And when it was over, Gafoor fled, leaving Lynette's blood-soaked body behind. That should have been the end of his freedom. In a just investigation, Gafoor's name would have surfaced quickly. But instead, the net of suspicion was cast wide across Tiger Bay. The police fixated on Stephen Miller and his circle. Evidence was bent to fit a theory. And in that vacuum, Gafoor vanished into obscurity, unnoticed, unchallenged, untouched. For years, he lived an ordinary life. He worked, he paid bills, he maintained relationships. All the while, the weight of his secret pressed down. He watched from the shadows as the Cardiff Five were arrested, tried, convicted. He saw men imprisoned for his crime, and he said nothing. It is hard to imagine the psychological toll of such silence. Did he feel relief, guilt, fear of discovery? Perhaps all three. But he remained hidden, shielded by the incompetence or worse, the willful blindness of the original investigation. The turning point came not through confession but through science. When investigators reopened the case in the early 2000s, new DNA techniques unlocked secrets the original detectives could not or would not uncover. Samples preserved from the scene yielded a clear genetic fingerprint. When it was run through the system, it pointed squarely at Gafoor. Confronted with the evidence, he broke. At first he denied. Then, slowly, the denial crumbled. Eventually, Gafoor confessed to what he had done all those years ago. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to Lynette White's murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The man who had once walked free while others rotted in cells was finally behind bars. But the timing mattered. His conviction did not undo the damage done to the Cardiff Five. It did not erase the years of wrongful imprisonment. It did not heal Lynette's family. In some ways, it deepened the wound, because it proved beyond doubt that the truth had always been there, waiting in the bloodstains, waiting in the science, waiting to be seen. Gafoor's name will never be remembered like the Cardiff Five. He is not the center of this story. He is its dark catalyst. A man whose violent act began a chain reaction of tragedy, injustice, and betrayal. And yet, his capture also represents the thin thread of hope. That truth, however delayed, can eventually surface. That science, impartial and unyielding, can succeed where human prejudice fails. Gafoor remains in prison, serving his life sentence. But the real sentence was carried by others. Men who bore his guilt for years, a family who mourned Lynette through false trials, and a community forever scarred by a crime that was his alone. When Jeffrey Gafoor finally confessed in 2003, the truth of Lynette White's murder was laid bare. But for many, catching the killer was only half the story. The deeper question remained. How had 5 innocent men been dragged through the courts for a crime they did not commit? The answer pointed back to South Wales police. For years, suspicions had swirled. Witnesses had recanted, admitting they were pressured to lie. Stephen Miller's so-called confession, once the centerpiece of the prosecution, was now widely seen as a textbook example of coercion. Files revealed alterations, inconsistencies, statements rewritten to match a preset theory. It was no longer possible to call this mere incompetence. The investigation into Lynette's murder had been corrupted from the inside. The Crown Prosecution Service took an extraordinary step, charging former detectives with perverting the course of justice. It was an unprecedented moment. The very officers who once commanded the courtroom now sat in the dock, accused of destroying lives in pursuit of a false conviction. The trial was immense in scale. More than a dozen former officers faced charges, alongside civilian witnesses accused of lying under oath. It was billed as the biggest police corruption case in British legal history. The stakes were enormous. Not just the fate of the officers, but the credibility of policing itself. In court, the prosecution laid out its case. They argued that detectives had been under pressure to solve Lynette's murder quickly. The city was demanding answers, the media circling, the Home Office watching. Faced with this pressure, officers had constructed a narrative, and then bent reality to fit it. Witnesses were coached, intimidated, or rewarded to give the right answers. Miller's confession was not a breakthrough but the product of hours of psychological battering. The Cardiff Five, they argued, were not suspects, they were scapegoats. The defense, of course, fought back. They painted the picture of dedicated officers doing their best with limited tools. Mistakes may have been made, they said, but mistakes are not crimes. They pointed to the passage of time, the fading memories of witnesses, the complexity of reconstructing events from 2 decades earlier. And they asked the jury to consider, if these officers were guilty of corruption, why had no one spoken out sooner? The trial stretched on for months. Testimony piled up, files were pored over, experts debated interrogation techniques. For the families of the Cardiff Five, it was another ordeal, watching the men who had once destroyed their lives now fight for their own reputations. And then, in a stunning twist, the trial collapsed. In December 2011, the judge ruled that the case against the officers was no longer sustainable. Key witnesses had changed their stories yet again. Memories had blurred beyond use, and the sheer weight of delay made a fair trial impossible. The officers walked free. For the Cardiff Five and their supporters, it was a bitter blow. They had waited decades for accountability, only to see justice slip away once more. To them, the collapse of the trial did not mean innocence for the officers. It meant the system had failed yet again, unable or unwilling to hold its own to account. The public reaction was fierce. Headlines spoke of a justice system in crisis. Campaigners decried the waste of millions of pounds on a trial that achieved nothing. For South Wales Police, it was another disaster. The force had already apologized for its role in the wrongful convictions. Now, its name was forever tied to the collapse of the biggest police corruption trial in British history. And for the Cardiff Five, the nightmare never truly ended. They were free, yes. They had been compensated. But there had been no reckoning, no moment where the officers who framed them admitted guilt, no closure. The corruption trial left the same question hanging in the air that had haunted the case from the beginning. If the truth cannot be found in the courts, then where can it be found at all? The collapse of the corruption trial in 2011 left a bitter taste. No officer was convicted. No individual was held personally responsible. And yet, the case did not fade away. Instead, it lived on in classrooms, in campaign groups, in political debates, as a defining symbol of how justice in Britain could fail. In legal circles, the Cardiff Five case became a study in what not to do. Law schools dissected it. The wrongful convictions were used to teach young lawyers about coerced confessions, unreliable witnesses, and the perils of tunnel vision in criminal investigations. Students were told, this is how miscarriages of justice happen, and this is how they ruin lives. For campaigners, the case was fuel. Groups that had already fought for the Birmingham Six and the Guildford Four now had another banner to carry. The Cardiff Five joined that dark roll call of names that exposed the flaws in British policing. The case became shorthand in debates about racism in the justice system, about the dangers of unchecked police power, and about the need for systemic reform. There were reforms, though they came slowly and often reluctantly. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, introduced in 1984, had already begun to shape how interrogations were conducted. By the 1990s and 2000s, videotaping of interviews became standard, a safeguard meant to prevent the kind of coercion inflicted on Stephen Miller. Training on vulnerable suspects improved, though campaigners argued it was never enough. The case also fed into broader conversations about institutional racism. The 1999 Macpherson report, sparked by the murder of Stephen Lawrence in London, had already declared British policing institutionally racist. The Cardiff Five case was cited as another grim example, proof that race and class shaped who was targeted, who was believed, and who was sacrificed when police needed results. For South Wales Police, the shadow was inescapable. Every press conference, every community meeting carried the weight of the past. The force issued apologies, spoke of lessons learned, and tried to rebuild trust. But in Butetown, trust was not easily restored. Too many families remembered the dawn raids, the interrogations, the sense that their sons and brothers were guilty until proven innocent. In popular culture, the case remained alive. Documentaries revisited it. Journalists kept writing about it. Dramas retold it for television audiences, sparking outrage in viewers who had never heard of Lynette White before. Each retelling reinforced the same lesson. Justice is not guaranteed. And then there was DNA. The scientific breakthrough that exposed Gafoor became a symbol of hope, proof that truth could survive even decades of lies. But it also sparked unease. If DNA was needed to undo miscarriages of justice, what happened to those whose cases had no such evidence to fall back on? How many men and women were still serving sentences built on coerced confessions and false witnesses? The Cardiff Five case did not end with Gafoor's conviction or with the officer's acquittal. Its true ending is still being written, in every courtroom where lawyers argue about the reliability of confessions, in every debate about police accountability, in every conversation about race and justice in Britain. For some, the lesson is bleak, that the system protects itself even at the cost of innocent lives. For others, the lesson is one of persistence, that truth can, eventually, break through, even if it takes decades. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: justice is not a guarantee. It is fragile, fallible, and dependent on the integrity of those who carry it out. The Cardiff Five learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Britain must never forget it. For all the attention given to the Cardiff Five, for all the headlines about police corruption and DNA breakthroughs, there is one truth that can never be forgotten. Lynette White was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's family. And for them, the tragedy did not end when the wrongful convictions were overturned. It did not end when Jeffrey Gafoor confessed. For Lynette's family, the tragedy never truly ended. In the early years, when the police announced arrests and paraded suspects before the press, Lynette's family clung to the belief that justice was being done. They wanted to trust that the system was working. After all, what parent, what sibling, would not want to believe that the people responsible for such a brutal act were being held to account? But as the years dragged on, as trials collapsed and appeals revealed cracks in the story, the family's grief grew heavier. They were not only grieving Lynette's loss, they were grieving the betrayal of a system that used her death as a stage for its failures. When the Cardiff Five were exonerated, the family's position was not simple. They had lived through years of being told these men were guilty. Now they were told the opposite. It was a whiplash of emotions. Relief that innocent men were not killers, anger that they had been accused in the first place, despair that Lynette's true killer was still out there. For years after her death, anniversaries passed quietly. Flowers left, tears shed, private acts of remembrance. But there was always the shadow of unfinished business. And when Gafoor was finally arrested in 2002, it brought with it a complicated kind of justice. On one hand, the truth was finally revealed. The real killer had been caught, and Lynette's family could finally put a name to the face of their daughter's murderer. But on the other hand, it reopened old wounds. They had been denied this truth for 14 years. 14 years of wrongful trials, appeals, retrials, corruption cases, while Gafoor lived freely, unchallenged. At Gafoor's sentencing, members of Lynette's family spoke out. They described the pain of waiting so long, the cruelty of knowing that justice delayed is, in many ways, justice denied. They wanted the world to know that Lynette was not forgotten, not just another case file, not just another victim lost in the machinery of the courts. But their struggle did not stop there. They campaigned for answers. Why had the wrong men been targeted? Why had it taken DNA evidence to reveal the truth? Why had no officer been punished for the lies told in Lynette's name? For them, the corruption trial's collapse was a second betrayal. It confirmed what they had come to fear, that the system could fail twice over and still carry on. In interviews over the years, Lynette's relatives often spoke of her not as the victim, but as the person she had been. A young woman who laughed, who dreamed, who deserved a chance at life. They wanted her remembered for who she was, not for how she died. Today, Lynette White's name is inseparable from the miscarriage of justice that followed her murder. But for her family, her name will always mean more. It is the name of a daughter, a sister, a loved one, whose memory they have carried through every twist of this painful journey. Their fight, in the end, was not only for justice. It was for dignity, to remind the world that behind the headlines, behind the courtroom battles, there was a young woman whose life mattered. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is that it took decades of injustice before that truth was finally heard. The story of the Cardiff Five cannot be told in isolation. It belongs to a larger, darker tradition in British justice. A chain of cases where the system failed, where innocence was crushed beneath the weight of flawed investigations, false confessions, and prejudice. By the time Lynette White was murdered in 1988, Britain already had a grim record. The names were notorious: the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, the Maguire 7, cases where men and women were accused of terrorism during the height of the IRA conflict. Cases where police used beatings, intimidation, and manipulation to extract confessions. Cases where juries convicted on shaky evidence because the narrative was powerful, the public clamored for justice, and the suspects looked like the villains society already feared. The Birmingham Six spent 16 years in prison before their convictions were overturned in 1991. The Guildford Four, accused of bombing a pub, served 15 years before being freed in 1989. The Maguire Seven, accused of making bombs, were exonerated in 1991, after serving up to a decade behind bars. Each case followed a similar pattern. Public outrage, intense pressure on police to deliver results, and vulnerable suspects who could be made to fit a story. Confessions were king. Once a confession was obtained, no matter how dubious, the rest of the case could be built around it. Evidence was twisted, witnesses were coached, and the narrative was sewn tightly together. The Cardiff Five fit that pattern exactly. A brutal murder shocked Cardiff. The city demanded answers. The police produced them not through careful investigation, but by bending reality until it snapped. Like the Birmingham Six and the Guildford Four, the Cardiff Five were victims of tunnel vision. Once police believed they had their suspects, everything else, facts, science, truth, became secondary. What makes the Cardiff case unique, however, is its timing. By the late 1980s, Britain should have learned its lesson. The wrongful convictions of the 1970s and early 1980s had already begun to unravel. Safeguards had been introduced. Pace was on the books. Interrogations were supposed to be monitored more closely. And yet, the same old patterns resurfaced. Why? Because laws can change, but culture is harder to shift. Institutional habits and institutional prejudices run deep. In Cardiff, those prejudices centered on Tiger Bay, on its black and mixed-race community, on young men who were convenient scapegoats. The parallels with earlier miscarriages of justice were stark. But the Cardiff Five added another dimension: race. In the decades that followed, these cases were linked together in public memory. Documentaries spoke of a decade of injustice. Campaigners drew lines from the Irish cases of the 1970s to the Cardiff case of the 1980s, to the Stephen Lawrence case of the 1990s. All told the same story: that British justice, when under pressure, could bend to prejudice and corruption. The common threads were clear: pressure from above to produce results quickly. Vulnerable suspects, unable to withstand relentless interrogation. Narratives shaped by prejudice, whether against Irish men in the 1970s or black men in the 1980s. A lack of accountability, with officers rarely punished even when innocence was proven. Together, these miscarriages forced Britain to confront uncomfortable truths: that its justice system was not immune to bias, that innocence could be crushed as easily as guilt, and that the safeguards meant to protect citizens were sometimes little more than paper shields. The Cardiff Five did not stand alone. They were part of a continuum that exposed not just flaws in policing, but the fragility of justice itself. From the very beginning, the media was an invisible character in the story of Lynette White's murder. Reporters didn't just sit in the courtroom or publish after the fact. They helped create the atmosphere in which justice was demanded, and too often distorted. When Lynette was first killed in 1988, the headlines were lurid. The violence of her death shocked Cardiff, and newspapers seized on the details. A young woman murdered on Valentine's Day, her body discovered in a flat in Butetown. To sell papers, her identity was reduced to a label: sex worker. It framed the story from the outset, shaping public perception of Lynette not as a young woman with dreams, but as someone living a dangerous life. The subtext was clear: the public should not be surprised by her fate. When arrests came, the coverage was dramatic. The Cardiff Five were portrayed as a gang, their faces splashed across front pages. Headlines leaned into stereotype: young, black or mixed-race men from Tiger Bay, caught up in a world of crime. Even Stephen Miller, the only white man, was folded into this narrative, described as the unstable boyfriend at the center of the storm. The press did not question the police theory. They reinforced it, and that mattered. Jurors, neighbors, and ordinary readers consumed these stories. The presumption of innocence, already fragile, was corroded by a media machine hungry for certainty. The message was simple: these were the guilty men, and justice was on its way. But as the case unraveled, the media shifted. When the convictions were quashed, the same newspapers that once declared guilt now spoke of miscarriages of justice. Television documentaries began to dig deeper. Journalists asked questions they had ignored in 1988. Why had Miller's confession been allowed? Why had witnesses changed their stories? Why had police clung so tightly to a theory that collapsed under scrutiny? By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Cardiff Five had become symbols of wrongful conviction, and the media helped amplify that. Investigative journalists exposed inconsistencies, interviewed family members, and pressured authorities to reopen the case. Without that pressure, the DNA investigation that eventually caught Jeffrey Gafoor might never have gained traction. Later still, dramatizations and documentaries cemented the case in public memory. Programs aired on national television, retelling the story in vivid detail. For viewers too young to remember the original trials, this was their first encounter with the case. And these retellings often did what the original coverage had failed to do: humanize the victims, the wrongly accused, and even the communities scarred by injustice. But for the Cardiff Five themselves, the media was always double-edged. The same cameras that filmed their wrongful convictions later filmed their release. The same headlines that branded them killers later labeled them victims. The whiplash was real and deeply painful. Ronnie Actie, in particular, often spoke about this paradox. For years, he avoided newspapers because they carried his face under the word murderer. Later, he cooperated with documentaries, believing it was the only way to set the record straight. For him, media attention was both a wound and a weapon. And through it all, Lynette White's memory was often caught in the middle. Too often reduced to the Valentine's Day murder victim, her humanity was overshadowed by the spectacle of trials and retrials. Only in later coverage did her story, her life, not just her death, begin to shine through. The Cardiff Five Case shows how powerful the media can be in shaping justice. It can be an accomplice to wrongful convictions, stoking prejudice and reinforcing false narratives. But it can also be a force for truth, exposing injustice and demanding accountability. In this story, it was both. Butetown, Cardiff, a neighborhood with a rich history, shaped by seafarers from across the globe. A place where Somali sailors, Caribbean migrants, Irish laborers, and families from the Middle East all made their homes. For generations, it was one of Britain's first truly multicultural communities, proud, diverse, and resilient. But to outsiders, Butetown carried a different image. To the media and, often, to the police, it was a place of crime, poverty, and danger. Tiger Bay was shorthand for trouble. And when Lynette White was murdered in 1988, those stereotypes flared into overdrive. The Cardiff Five arrests confirmed what many residents had long suspected: that in the eyes of South Wales police, Butetown was guilty until proven innocent. Young men were rounded up, interrogated, and treated as suspects not because of evidence, but because of who they were and where they lived. Race was not incidental, it was central. For the community, the wrongful convictions deepened a wound that was already raw. Families watched as their sons, brothers, and neighbors were dragged through the courts. The message was chilling. If this could happen to the Cardiff Five, it could happen to anyone in Butetown. Trust in the police, already fragile, was shattered. Older residents recalled that policing in Tiger Bay had always been fraught. Stop-and-search tactics, heavy-handed raids, and dismissive attitudes were part of daily life. The Lynette White case confirmed those fears on a grand scale, showing how far the system could go to sacrifice black and mixed-race men in the name of justice. The case also reinforced divisions between Butetown and the rest of Cardiff. In other parts of the city, headlines about the Cardiff Five fed prejudices. Whispered comments about crime in Tiger Bay, about who could be trusted, about what kind of people lived there. A murder case that should have united the city in grief instead drove wedges deeper. And yet, in the face of this, the community rallied. Campaigners emerged from Butetown who refused to let the Cardiff Five be forgotten. Local activists joined forces with national justice groups, ensuring that the case stayed in the spotlight. Families leaned on one another for strength, building networks of resilience that stretched beyond Cardiff. Decades later, the scars remain. Many in Butetown still speak of the case as a turning point, proof that the system was stacked against them. For young people growing up in the 1990s and 2000s, the story of the Cardiff Five was not history. It was a warning passed down from their parents. Be careful, because justice here doesn't always mean justice for us. Butetown's story is not just one of pain. It is also one of survival. Out of the ashes of the Lynette White case came a stronger determination to speak out, to demand accountability, to refuse silence. And while mistrust of the police never disappeared, the community's refusal to let the case fade ensured that Lynette and the Cardiff Five were remembered. The legacy of Butetown is this: a neighborhood too often blamed, too often stereotyped, yet never broken. A place where injustice was resisted, even when it came from the highest levels of authority. The story began with a young woman, Lynette White, murdered on Valentine's Day, 1988. She was just 20 years old. Her life was cut short in a frenzy of violence, her future stolen in an instant. But as terrible as that crime was, what followed became an even deeper tragedy. 5 innocent men, Stephen Miller, John and Ronnie Actie, Yusef Abdullahi and Tony Paris, were dragged into a nightmare. They were accused, interrogated, paraded as killers. 3 were convicted and sent to prison. All carried the weight of suspicion for years. Their lives were broken not by the act of one killer, but by the decisions of an entire system. The case exposed the darkest sides of British justice. Police tunnel vision, coerced confessions, unreliable witnesses, and the corrosive influence of racism and prejudice. It showed how institutions designed to protect the public could instead destroy lives, and how fragile the idea of justice truly is when truth becomes secondary to results. It took 14 years for the real killer, Jeffrey Gafoor, to be caught. 14 years of wrongful convictions, of appeals, of mistrust, of grief. And even when Gafoor confessed, justice was incomplete. The officers accused of perverting the course of justice stood trial, but that case collapsed, leaving no one accountable for the destruction of the Cardiff Five. And yet, out of this darkness, some light emerged. The case helped change the way Britain understood miscarriages of justice. It forced conversations about coerced confessions, about institutional racism, about the urgent need for police reform. It became a teaching tool in universities, a rallying cry for campaigners, and a permanent reminder that justice is not guaranteed. But above all, this is Lynette's story, a young woman whose life mattered. Too often, her name was overshadowed by the scandal that followed. Too often, she became a case file, a headline, a symbol. But she was also a daughter, a friend, a young woman with hopes and dreams. She deserved more than to be remembered only for her death. And it is the Cardiff Five story. Men who endured the unendurable, accused of a crime they did not commit, vilified by press and public, betrayed by a system that should have protected them. Their survival, their persistence, and their refusal to be erased are testimonies to human endurance. It is also Butetown's story, a community scarred by injustice, yet unbroken. A neighborhood that endured suspicion, prejudice, and betrayal, yet continued to fight for dignity and truth. The lessons of this case are clear. Justice must be transparent, accountability must be real, and the lives of the vulnerable must never be treated as expendable. If we forget those lessons, the cycle will repeat, with new names, new victims, new families shattered. Lynette White's case is now carved into Britain's history of justice. A cautionary tale, a tragedy, and a call to vigilance. For every juror, every lawyer, every police officer, every citizen, it asks the same question. Will we remember? Because justice is not an inheritance. It is not guaranteed. It is something that must be fought for, guarded, and demanded again and again. And so, decades later, as we speak her name, we honor not just the tragedy but the truth. Lynette White, the Cardiff Five, community scarred, a nation warned. This is their story, and it must never be forgotten.